Sable had not woken up this morning expecting to punch the son of a High Lord in the throat. Yet here she stood in the middle of the Thornhaven Market Square, knuckles throbbing, watching Lord Harkin's eldest boy stumble backward into a cart of winter cabbages with a look of pure, offended disbelief on his face. The crowd had gone silent. Every merchant, every shopper, every guard within earshot had frozen mid-motion, staring at her like she had just set fire to the cathedral. Sable's hand hurt. Her pulse roared in her ears, and the small, trembling old woman behind her was clutching the back of Sable's coat like it was the last solid thing in the world. It had started with nothing. The old woman, hunched and frail, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, had bumped into Corin Harkin's shoulder while reaching for a bundle of dried sage. She had apologized immediately, her voice thin and shaking. Corin had not accepted the apology. He had grabbed the sage from her hands and thrown it to the ground. Called her a useless crone. Told her she smelled like a dying animal, and that strays like her should be put down before they infected the rest of the pack. His two friends had laughed. The merchants had looked away. The guards had studied their boots with sudden fascination. And Sable, who had been standing 3 stalls down buying bandaged linen for the shelter she worked at, had watched the old woman flinch like she had been struck, and something inside her had snapped clean in half. She could not remember crossing the distance. She remembered Corin's smirk when she stepped between them. She remembered his hand reaching past her to shove the old woman again, and she remembered the satisfying crunch of her knuckles connecting with the soft tissue of his throat. Now Corin was coughing into a pile of cabbages, his face turning an alarming shade of red, and his two friends were staring at Sable with expressions that promised violence. The old woman's fingers tightened on her coat. "You!" Corin wheezed, dragging himself upright. His eyes were watering. "You just struck a high-born wolf." "You were hurting an elder," Sable said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Walk away." Corin's lip curled. "Do you know what happens to gutter wolves who raise their hands against the bloodlines?" Sable knew exactly what happened. She had seen it before. Public flogging at best. Exile at worst. Death, if the Lord was feeling righteous about it. Her stomach clenched, but she held her ground. "I said walk away," she repeated. Corin lunged. Sable braced herself, already knowing she could not win this fight. He was bigger, trained, and highborn, which meant faster and stronger in every way that mattered. But the blow never landed. A voice cut through the square like a blade through silk, quiet and absolute, and utterly commanding. "That will be enough." Every person in the market dropped to one knee. Every single one. Merchants, shoppers, guards. Even Corin's friends hit the ground so fast their knees cracked against the cobblestones. Corin froze mid-lunge, the color draining from his face. Sable turned and saw a woman standing at the edge of the square. She was tall, silver-haired, dressed in deep charcoal wool with no jewelry and no escort. Her posture was straight as a sword. Her eyes, pale gray and sharp enough to cut glass, swept the scene with the calm assessment of someone who had witnessed 1,000 small cruelties and grown tired of every single one. Sable did not recognize her, but her wolf did. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to kneel, to submit, to bare her throat. The dominance radiating from this woman was unlike anything Sable had ever felt. It pressed against her like a physical weight. Sable dropped to her knees. The woman's gaze settled on her, then moved to the old woman still clinging to Sable's coat. Then to Corin, who looked like he might be sick. "Rise," the woman said to Sable. "You and I are going to have a conversation." She turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. Sable stared after her, her heart hammering, her knuckles still aching, and felt the first cold flicker of genuine terror. Because she had just realized who the woman was. Iselda Voss, the Alpha King's mother. The guardhouse off the Eastern Market was small, cold, and smelled of old iron and stale sweat. Sable sat on a wooden bench with her hands pressed flat against her thighs to keep them from trembling. Through the narrow window she could see the market square returning to its usual chaos. Merchants shouting prices, carts rattling over cobblestones, life carrying on as though nothing had happened. Inside the guardhouse, nothing was carrying on at all. Iselda Voss sat across from her in a chair that looked far too rough for royalty, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. 2 guards stood by the door, their faces carefully blank. "Your name," Iselda said. It was not a question. It was an instruction. "Sable Wren," Sable managed, and immediately wished her voice had not cracked on the second syllable. Iselda studied her the way a jeweler studies a stone, turning it in the light, looking for fractures. "Sable Wren. No family name I recognize. No pack affiliation I am aware of. You work at the shelter on Cinder Row." Sable blinked. That was not publicly known. The shelter operated quietly, funded by the temple's charity coffers, serving wolves who had lost their packs through exile, abandonment, or violence. Sable had worked there for 3 years, bandaging wounds, stretching meals, holding the hands of dying elders who had no one else. "How do you know that?" Sable asked before she could stop herself. Iselda's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement that the question had been asked. "I know many things that are not publicly known. It is the privilege and burden of my position." Sable swallowed hard. "Your Grace, about what happened in the square, I know I struck a highborn. I know the penalty. But he was hurting an elder who could not defend herself, and the guards were doing nothing, and I could not just stand there and watch." "You could have," Iselda said calmly. "Most people did." The words landed like a slap. "Tell me," Iselda continued, leaning forward slightly. "Do you know who that old woman was?" Sable shook her head. "No, I have never seen her before. She was just a woman buying herbs." Something shifted in Iselda's expression, too fast for Sable to read. "She is called Brielle. She lives in the lower ward. She has no pack, no family, no one to speak for her. She is precisely the kind of wolf your shelter exists to serve." Sable nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "And you hit the son of Lord Harkin for her," Iselda said, "without knowing her name, without knowing whether anyone would help you, without knowing whether you would survive it." "He was going to hit her again," Sable said. Her voice had gone quiet. "I saw his hand. She could not take another blow." The weight of those words hung between them like stone. Iselda rose from her chair. "Come with me." Sable's stomach dropped. "Where?" "The palace," Iselda said. "There is something I need you to see." The walk to the palace took 20 minutes, and every step felt like walking toward an execution she could not comprehend. Iselda moved through the streets without escort, without announcement, without a single guard clearing her path, and yet every wolf they passed stepped aside without being told. They felt her the way Sable had felt her in the square, that crushing, undeniable authority that lived in her bones. Sable trailed behind her, her mind spinning through every possible reason the Alpha King's mother would bring a shelter worker to the palace, and none of them were good. They entered through a side gate that Sable had never seen, through a corridor lined with portraits she could not name, up a staircase she had never climbed. Iselda stopped at a heavy oak door and turned to face her. "What I am about to show you does not leave this room," she said. "Swear it." "I swear," Sable said, her mouth dry. Iselda pushed open the door. The room beyond was large and dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon light. A fire burned low in the hearth. And in the center of the room, slumped in a chair behind a desk covered in scattered documents, was the Alpha King. Sable had never seen him this close. King Calum Voss was spoken of in the same breath as storms and sieges. He had crushed the Ashfang Rebellion at 22, had united the fractured borderlands through a campaign so decisive it was still studied by military scholars. He was enormous, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair and a jaw that looked carved from granite. but the man in front of her bore no resemblance to a conqueror. He looked hollow. His skin carried a grayish pallor beneath the bronze. The bones of his cheeks stood out too sharply. His eyes were closed, but his face was not peaceful. It was the face of someone enduring something, even in unconsciousness. "How long has he been like this?" Sable whispered. "He is not sleeping," Iselda said quietly. "He is unconscious. There is a difference." She crossed the room and touched her son's shoulder. His eyes snapped open instantly, wild and unfocused, his hand shooting out to grip the arm of the chair so hard the wood groaned. For a single terrifying second, his gaze was not human. Then it cleared. He saw his mother, and his hand released. "How long?" he asked, his voice raw. 11 minutes, Iselda replied. Caleb pressed his fingers against his temples and exhaled through his teeth. He had not noticed Sable standing in the doorway. Or perhaps he had, and simply lacked the energy to care. "The longest stretch this week," Iselda murmured, more to Sable than to him. "He has not slept more than a few minutes at a time in over 14 months. Sable's breath caught. 14 months? That should not be possible. Even for an alpha, even for a shifter, 14 months of near-total sleeplessness would destroy the body, would erode the mind, would kill him. She looked at the king again with new eyes and saw it now, the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes could not quite focus, the exhaustion carved so deep into his face that it looked permanent. "Why are you showing me this?" Sable asked. Iselda watched her son push himself upright at his desk, watched him reach for a document with shaking hands, watched him try to read it and fail because the words would not hold still. "Because every healer in the kingdom has tried," Iselda said. "Every herb, every tonic, every remedy. Nothing works. And I am running out of time." She turned to Sable, and for the first time the composure cracked. Just barely. Just enough for Sable to see the fear underneath. "I brought you here because of why you hit Lord Harkin's son. Because you saw someone suffering and you could not look away. Because you acted when no one else would." She paused, her gaze sharpening. "I need someone who will not look away from my son." Sable stood in the corridor outside the king's study, her back against the cold stone wall, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Iselda had given her instructions. Simple, impossible instructions. She was to remain in the palace. She was to be present near the king during his working hours. She was to observe and report anything she noticed about his condition, his behavior, his responses. "You are not a healer," Iselda had said, "and that is precisely why I want you. The healers see symptoms. I need someone who sees people." Sable had wanted to argue. She bandaged cuts and stretched soup. She held the hands of dying wolves and sang them through the worst of it. She was not qualified to observe a king, but Iselda had not asked. She had informed. And there was no arguing with the Alpha King's mother. A door opened at the end of the corridor and a man stepped through, tall, lean, with the controlled grace of someone trained to be dangerous and the calm expression of someone who had decided not to be. He stopped when he saw her. "You must be the one Lady Iselda brought in," he said. His voice was measured, precise. "I am Fenwick, the king's steward." "Sable Wren," she said. Fenwick studied her for a moment, his gaze cataloging everything, her rough hands, her mended coat, the fading bruise on her knuckles from Corin Harkin's throat. Whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it behind his eyes. "The king does not know you are here," Fenwick said. "Not specifically. He knows his mother has brought someone new into the household. He will not ask why, because he has learned that arguing with Lady Iselda is an exercise in futility." Sable almost smiled at that. "Almost. What do I need to know?" she asked. Fenwick was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "He is dying." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "The sleeplessness is destroying him," Fenwick continued, his voice betraying nothing. His body is eating itself. His wolf is destabilizing. The healers estimate he has 4, perhaps 5 months before his organs begin to fail. Sable blinked at him. And no one knows? The inner court knows. The council suspects. The kingdom at large believes their king is simply a man who works too hard and rests too little. Fenwick's jaw tightened. That illusion is all that is keeping the borderlands from fracturing again. If the Pax find out that Alpha King is dying, Sable said slowly. War, Fenwick finished, within the month. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. She held dying hands and sang quiet songs and made thin soup last for 30 mouths. And now she was standing in the palace being told the king was dying and the kingdom would burn if anyone found out. I am going to need a better explanation of what exactly Lady Iselda thinks I can do here, Sable said. Fenwick's expression remained unreadable. Survive tomorrow. That will be enough for now. Tomorrow came too fast. A servant woke her before dawn in the small room she had been given near the kitchens. Sable dressed in the plain clothes that had been left for her, dark linen, nothing that would draw attention, and followed a guard through unfamiliar corridors. They stopped outside a heavy door. The guard knocked once and pushed it open. The king's private study was warmer than she expected. A fire burned steadily in the hearth. Shelves lined every wall, packed with leather-bound volumes and scrolled maps. A massive desk dominated the center, and behind it sat Calum Voss, reading a report with the determined focus of a man fighting to keep his eyes open. He looked worse in the morning light. The shadows beneath his eyes were darker. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced. He held the quill like it weighed 10 pounds. Sit, he said without looking up. Wherever you like. Do not speak unless spoken to. Sable chose a chair by the far wall, near the fire, and sat. She folded her hands in her lap and watched him. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The quill scratched across parchment. The king read, wrote, turned pages. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. 2 advisors entered. They spoke in low, urgent voices about grain shipments and a territorial dispute along the northern border. The king listened, asked questions in a voice that was steady but hollow, made decisions that sounded correct but cost him visible effort. Sable watched. She noticed the way his eyes drifted and snapped back. The way his left hand gripped the edge of the desk when he thought no one was looking. The way his body desperately tried to pull him under for a few seconds before he wrenched himself back to consciousness. 20 minutes, 30. The advisors left. The king kept writing. His pen slowed, stopped, started again, slower. Then his head dipped forward, just slightly, and his eyes closed. Sable held her breath. 1 second. 2, 3. His eyes opened. He pressed his palm against his forehead and exhaled hard through his nose. He turned his head and looked directly at her, as though he had only just remembered she existed. His gaze was sharp despite the exhaustion, gray eyes the exact shade of his mother's, cutting through the dim light like a blade. You are the one who hit Corin Harkin, he said. Sable's throat tightened. Yes, Your Majesty. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He outweighs you by at least 80 pounds. I was not thinking about his weight at the time, Sable said. Something flickered in his expression. Not amusement, exactly. More like recognition. Like he understood what it meant to act before the math caught up. My mother believes you can help me, he said. I do not know if that is true, Sable replied honestly. Neither do I, the king said. He turned back to his documents. But she is rarely wrong, and I am too tired to argue. The quiet settled back over the room. Sable sat, watched, and waited. An hour passed. The king's pen stopped moving. His head dipped again, deeper this time, and did not come back up. His breath changed, deepened, loosened, became something real and unguarded. He was asleep. Sable stayed perfectly still and watched the lines of tension melt from his face one by one until what remained was something younger, softer, almost vulnerable. The fire popped. The king did not stir. 40 minutes passed before the door opened and Fenwick stepped inside. He stopped when he saw the king's head resting on his folded arms, his breath deep and even. The steward's expression remained composed, but something shifted in his eyes, something raw and startled. He looked at Sable. "How long?" he mouthed. Sable held up 4 fingers, then made a 0. 40 minutes. Fenwick stood motionless. Then he backed out of the room without making a sound and closed the door with excruciating care. Sable sat in the quiet study, watching the Alpha King sleep, and wondered what on earth she had gotten herself into. The king slept for nearly 2 hours before he woke with a sharp intake of breath, his hand slamming flat against the desk with enough force to rattle the inkwell. His eyes were wild for a moment, disoriented, scanning the room like he could not place where he was. Then his gaze found Sable, and he stilled. "How long?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "Close to 2 hours," Sable replied carefully. Something crossed his face, too fast for her to read. Surprise, confusion, suspicion, all layered together and buried before any of them could take root. He straightened in his chair, rolled his shoulders, and reached for his quill like nothing had happened. But his hands were steadier than before. His eyes were clearer, and the gray pallor of his skin had warmed by a fraction, just enough to notice if you were looking. Sable was looking. She returned to her small room that evening and found Iselda waiting inside, sitting on the narrow bed like she owned it, which, technically, she did. 2 hours, Iselda said. "Fenwick told you," Sable guessed. "Fenwick tells me everything. That is why he is still employed." Iselda's gaze was steady and intent. "The longest he has slept in 14 months was 23 minutes. You were in the room, and he slept for 2 hours." Sable sat down heavily on the room's only chair. "I did not do anything. I just sat there." "Yes," Iselda said. "I know." She paused, studying Sable with that unnerving precision. "We are going to repeat this. You will be present in his study every day during his working hours. Same chair. Same distance." "For how long?" Sable asked. "Until we understand why this is working," Iselda replied. "Or until it stops." It did not stop. The next day, Sable took her seat by the fire and the king worked at his desk without acknowledging her. An hour in, he fell asleep and remained under for 2.5 hours. The day after that, 3 hours. On the 4th day, the king looked up from his documents and said, "You do not fidget." Sable blinked. "Pardon?" "Everyone fidgets," he said. "The advisors shift in their seats. Fenwick adjusts his cuffs. My mother taps her ring against whatever surface is nearest, though she will deny it to her grave. You sit without moving." "I work at a shelter," Sable said. "Half the wolves who come through our doors are feral with grief or pain. You learn to be still. Movement startles them." The king considered this. "You are treating me like a feral wolf." "I am treating you like someone who needs quiet," Sable corrected. He held her gaze, then turned back to his work. But the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, in what might have been the ghost of something approaching the distant neighborhood of a smile. A rhythm formed, mornings in the study. The king worked. Sable sat. He slept. Always at his desk. Always without warning, his body simply surrendering when it could no longer fight. She kept track of the hours. Fenwick appeared at regular intervals to check, his expression never changing, but his eyes growing more hopeful each day. By the end of the first week, the king was averaging 4 hours of sleep during daytime working sessions. His tremor had decreased. His color had improved. He could hold a quill without his hand shaking. But he was also watching her. Sable noticed it on the 5th day. Quick glances when he thought she was absorbed in her own thoughts. His gaze would leave the document, find her, linger for a heartbeat, and snap back. It happened 3 times in a single morning. On the 6th day, he spoke to her unprompted for the 2nd time. "The shelter on Cinder Row," he said. "How many wolves do you house?" Sable was startled enough that she answered without thinking. "It depends on the season. In winter, as many as 40. In summer, usually around 20. Funding? Temple charity coffers. It is never enough." "And the woman from the market? Brielle. Has she come to the shelter before?" Sable paused. "I had never seen her before that day." The king nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He wrote something in the margin of his report and said nothing more. That evening, Iselda summoned Sable to her private sitting room, a chamber so elegant and restrained it made Sable feel like a smudge on fine linen. The Alpha King's mother sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, a cup of something fragrant steaming in her hands. "Sit," Iselda said. "We need to discuss what is happening." Sable sat. "I still do not understand what is happening." "Nor do I entirely," Iselda admitted. "The court physicians have a theory. They believe you carry a calming resonance." "A what?" "Every wolf produces a pheromonal signature. Yours, they believe, carries an unusually strong grounding frequency, something that signals safety to the subconscious mind. The theory is that your presence suppresses whatever keeps driving his body back to wakefulness." Sable processed this. "So, I am a living sedative." "Crudely put, but not inaccurate," Iselda said. She took a sip from her cup. "The physicians also believe that proximity may enhance the effect. Closer distance, deeper sleep." Sable's stomach tightened. "How close?" Iselda set down her cup. "They recommend you sleep in an adjacent chamber, connected by an open doorway." "An adjacent chamber," Sable repeated. "To the king's bedchamber," Iselda confirmed, her expression perfectly composed. Sable opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I am a shelter worker from Cinder Row." "Yes." "And you want me to sleep next door to the Alpha King?" "I want my son to survive the year," Iselda said, and the composure cracked again, just barely. Just enough for Sable to see the mother underneath the matriarch. "Will you help me?" Sable thought of the tremor in his hands, the hollows in his cheeks, the wildness in his eyes when he woke. She thought of Fenwick saying he is dying with no emotion in his voice and all of it in his eyes. "Yes," Sable said, "I will help." The adjacent chamber was not what she expected. Instead of a servant's cot and basin, it was a proper bedchamber furnished with obvious care, a thick mattress, warm blankets, a writing desk with a candle already burning. The connecting door stood open. Through it, she could see the edge of the king's bed, the glow of his hearth, the long shadow he cast as he moved through his nighttime routine. Sable changed into the nightclothes that had been provided and climbed into bed. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware that she could hear him through the open doorway, the creak of his bed as he settled, the slow, deliberate pattern of his breath, the rhythm of a man trying to force his body to do something it had forgotten how to do. She listened. The fire in her own hearth crackled softly. Through the doorway, his rhythm changed, deepened. The deliberate pattern gave way to something involuntary, something real. He was asleep. Sable exhaled slowly and let her own eyes close. She woke to the sound of a chair scraping against stone. Gray morning light filled the room. She sat up, disoriented, and found Fenwick standing in her doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "He slept through the night," Fenwick said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. 7 hours, uninterrupted. Sable stared at him. 7 hours, Fenwick repeated, as though he needed to say it again to believe it. "The physicians are beside themselves." Through the connecting doorway, she heard the king getting dressed with more energy than she had witnessed in the entire week she had been here. His footsteps approached the connecting door. She pulled the blankets up to her chin instinctively, suddenly aware that she was in her nightclothes and her hair was a disaster. The king appeared in the doorway. He was dressed, his hair still damp, his posture straighter than she had ever seen it. The hollows in his cheeks were the same, but his eyes were different. Brighter, sharper, present in a way they had not been before. He looked at her, and neither spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sable nodded, her throat tight. He turned to leave, then stopped. "The shelter on Cinder Row. You said the funding was never enough." "It is not," Sable confirmed, confused by the shift. "I have instructed the Treasury to triple the allocation from the charity coffers," the king said, without looking at her. "Effective immediately. There will also be a building inspection within the week to assess structural repairs." He left before she could respond. Sable sat in the borrowed bed, in the borrowed room, in the borrowed nightclothes, and pressed her hands against her face. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She cried. 2 weeks passed, and Sable learned the shape of the king's silence. He was not a man who filled space with words. He worked. He read. He made decisions that moved thousands of lives with a stroke of his pen, and he did it all in a quiet so deep it felt like a held breath. But within that quiet, Sable began to hear things. The way his quill paused when a report contained bad news, hovering above the page for a fraction of a second before he committed his response. The low exhale through his nose when an advisor said something foolish. The almost imperceptible shift in his posture when exhaustion began to creep back in, a forward tilt of his shoulders, a loosening in his grip. She learned to read him the way she read the wolves at the shelter, through stillness and attention, and the more she watched, the more she saw. She also saw the toll the sleeplessness had taken, not just on his body, but on his isolation. No one touched him. Not the advisors, not the guards, not even Fenwick. They kept a careful distance, not out of fear exactly, but out of a learned understanding that the king could not tolerate unpredictability. His senses were too raw, his nerves too frayed, his wolf too close to the surface. Sable was the exception, not because she touched him, but because her stillness never registered as a threat. She existed in his space without disrupting it, and that, apparently, was rare enough to matter. On the 15th night of the arrangement, Sable woke to a sound she had never heard before. It came through the open doorway, low and guttural and wrong. Not a groan. Not a word. Something deeper. Something pulled from the chest of a creature that was not entirely human. Sable sat up, her pulse spiking. Through the doorway, she could see the king's bed. He was thrashing, his body rigid, the sheets twisted around his legs. His hands were clenched into fists against the mattress, and the sound coming from his throat was climbing, building into something that vibrated through the stone walls. His wolf was surfacing. Sable threw back her covers and moved to the doorway. She could feel it now, the dominance pouring off him in waves, suffocating and primal, pressing against her like a wall of heat. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to submit, to drop, to run. She stepped into his room. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice cutting through the dark. Steady, calm. The same voice she used at the shelter when a grieving wolf was halfway between human and beast. "You are in your chambers. You are safe. Come back." His eyes snapped open. They were not gray. They were gold, bright and burning, and entirely wolf. He lunged upright, his hand closing around her wrist with crushing speed, and Sable gasped as she was yanked forward. For one terrible heartbeat, he was not behind those eyes. His grip was iron, his body coiled for violence. She could feel the pressure building against her bones. "Sable," she said, keeping her voice level despite the pain. "My name is Sable, you know me. I sit in the chair by the fire. I do not fidget." His breath hitched. "I am the one who punched Corin Harkin in the throat," she added, because she was terrified, and it was the only other thing she could think to say. The gold in his eyes flickered, dimmed. Gray bled back in, slow and unsteady, like color returning to a bruised sky. His grip loosened. He looked down at his hand around her wrist and released her like she had burned him. "Did I hurt you?" His voice was wrecked, shredded, barely human. "No," Sable lied. Her wrist was throbbing. He saw the lie. She watched him see it. His gaze dropped to her wrist, to the red marks already forming, and something in his expression collapsed. "Get out," he said. "Your Majesty, I am fine. Get out of my room." The words were quiet and devastated, and they hurt worse than her wrist. Sable backed toward the doorway. He turned away from her, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, his shoulders drawn in like he was trying to make himself smaller. She stood in the doorway and refused to leave. "I said get out," he repeated without looking up. "I heard you," Sable said. "But I do not take orders from you. I take them from your mother." His head came up. He stared at her, something raw and startled breaking through the shame on his face. "Go to sleep, Your Majesty," Sable said softly. "I will be right here." She sat down on the floor in the doorway, her back against the frame, her bruised wrist cradled in her lap. Caleb stared at her for a long, suspended moment. Then he lay back down, slowly, like a man lowering himself into water he was not sure would hold him. His breath evened, his hands unclenched. He slept. Sable sat in the doorway until dawn. She watched the firelight move across his face and felt something she could not yet name settle deep behind her ribs, something warm and aching and terribly inconvenient. In the morning, she found a small jar of bruise salve on her bedside table. It had not been there when she fell asleep. She looked toward the connecting doorway. The king was already gone. Sable never mentioned the bruise salve. The king never mentioned the nightmare. They returned to their rhythm as though nothing had changed, except that everything had. He watched her more now. Not the quick, stolen glances of before, but longer looks. Deliberate, as though he was trying to solve a problem she represented. Sometimes she caught him and held his gaze, and he was always the first to look away, turning back to his documents with a tightening in his jaw that she was beginning to recognize as discomfort of a very specific kind. She was beginning to recognize a lot of things. The way her body loosened when she entered his study each morning, like a fist unclenching. The way her pulse settled into a calmer rhythm the closer she sat to him. The way his scent, leather and wood smoke, and something sharp beneath, had started following her through the palace corridors long after she had left his presence. She tried not to think about it. She was from Cinder Row. He was the Alpha King. There were approximately 400 reasons why the growing warmth she felt near him was a terrible idea, and she was determined to ignore every single one of them. On the 18th day, the arrangement changed. Iselda summoned her to the sitting room again. The physicians were there this time, 3 men in dark robes who looked at Sable with the detached curiosity of people studying an interesting specimen. "The data is clear," the lead physician said, addressing Iselda while gesturing at a chart Sable could not read from her seat. "Proximity correlates directly with sleep duration and depth. The adjacent chamber configuration has yielded significant improvement, but the data suggests that reducing the distance further would produce even greater results." "Define further," Sable said, her stomach already tightening. The physician glanced at her as though surprised she could speak. "Same room, ideally within arm's reach." The quiet that followed was so thick Sable could have choked on it. "No," she said. Iselda raised an eyebrow. "With respect, Lady Iselda, I am not going to sleep in the king's bedchamber," Sable said, her face burning. "The court already whispers about why I am here. If I move into his room, every wolf in this palace will assume I am warming his bed." "And what precisely would be wrong with that assumption?" Iselda asked, her tone perfectly innocent and entirely dangerous. Sable's mouth opened, closed. She looked at the Alpha King's mother with a dawning, horrifying understanding. "You are not just trying to help him sleep," Sable said slowly. "You are positioning me." Iselda said nothing. For the throne, Sable continued, the blood draining from her face. That is why you chose me. Not because I can help him sleep. Because you think I am mate material. The physicians suddenly found their charts extremely fascinating. Iselda took a measured sip from her cup. I chose you, Iselda said carefully, because you punched a highborn wolf in the throat to protect a stranger. Because you work with the broken and the abandoned and the dying, and you do it for no recognition and no reward. Because when my son's wolf surfaced in the dark and gripped your wrist hard enough to bruise, you sat down in the doorway and told him to go to sleep. She set down her cup. I chose you because this kingdom needs a queen who sees people, not bloodlines, and my son needs a mate who will not break the first time he does. Sable sat in the elegant chair in the elegant room and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He has never shown any interest in me beyond polite tolerance, she managed. The look Iselda gave her was so layered with meaning it could have filled a library. Child, she said gently, my son left bruised salve on your bedside table in the middle of the night. He tripled funding to a shelter he had never heard of because you mentioned it in passing. He sleeps, genuinely sleeps, for the first time in over a year because you exist in his vicinity. She paused. If that is polite tolerance, then I am a common house cat. Sable's face was on fire. Move into the chamber, Iselda said. There will be a partition. You will have privacy, but you will be in the room. Sable wanted to argue. She wanted to say this was manipulation, that Iselda was engineering an outcome, that she was being moved around a board like a chess piece. But she thought of his hands shaking over his documents. She thought of the gold in his eyes and the devastation on his face when he saw the marks on her wrist. She thought of 4 months, maybe 5, before his organs began to fail. Fine, Sable said, but I want a proper screen, not some flimsy curtain. Iselda smiled. It was the first real smile Sable had ever seen on her face, and it transformed her entirely. Done. The partition was solid oak, carved with trailing ivy, and it divided the king's bedchamber into 2 spaces. Sable's side had a narrow bed, a nightstand, and a candle. The king's side had everything else. Calum stood on his side of the partition, staring at it with an expression that suggested he was considering setting it on fire. This was not my decision, he said. Nor mine, Sable replied from behind the screen. A pause. Are you comfortable? The bed is better than anything I have ever owned, Sable admitted. So yes. Another pause, longer this time. I am sorry about your wrist. It is healed. That is not what I asked. Sable rested her hand on the pillow. Through the screen she could see nothing but firelight and shadow, but she could feel him. His presence filled the room, steady and immense, like standing beside a river and sensing the current pull. You did not mean to hurt me, she said quietly, and I stayed because I wanted to. Do not apologize for something we both survived. What followed was different from the other pauses, heavier, warmer, charged with something Sable refused to name. Good night, Sable, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Good night, Your Majesty, she replied, and her voice held steady, which she considered a significant personal victory. He fell asleep within minutes. She could hear it through the screen, the way the room itself seemed to exhale when his body finally let go. She listened and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, where the ache had settled into something permanent. She fell asleep with the rhythm of his rest in her ears and dreamed of nothing at all. In the morning, she found a small bundle on her nightstand. Inside was a pair of gloves, fine leather, lined with wool, the kind of thing she could never afford. No note, no explanation. Through the screen, the king's side of the room was already empty. Sable put on the gloves. They fit perfectly. The gloves were the beginning. Small things began appearing with a regularity that Sable could no longer dismiss as coincidence. A wool scarf draped over her chair in the study on a cold morning. a book of herbal remedies left on her nightstand with a passage about shelter medicine marked with a thin strip of leather. A pot of honey placed beside her breakfast plate because she had mentioned once, to Fenwick, not even to the king, that she preferred honey to sugar in her tea. The king never acknowledged any of it. And Sable, who had spent her entire life receiving nothing from anyone, had no idea how to acknowledge it either. So the gifts accumulated in silence, small acts of attention from a man who could not speak his feelings aloud, received by a woman who could not believe she deserved them. What she did know was that the pull was getting worse. Not painful, exactly. More like a tide, strongest in the mornings when she woke to the sound of him and weakest in the brief hours they spent apart during the afternoons. Her wolf, dormant for most of her life, had become restless. She paced beneath Sable's skin, pressing toward the surface at odd moments, responding to something Sable could feel but refused to name. She knew what it was. She had seen bonded pairs at the shelter, had witnessed the recognition, the almost gravitational need to be close. She knew the signs. She also knew that acknowledging it would change everything, and she was not ready for everything to change. On the 26th day, everything changed anyway. It started with a council meeting. Sable had not been invited, had never been invited to anything official, but the king had asked her to wait in the anteroom in case he needed to rest afterward. So she sat on a bench outside the council chamber and listened to muffled voices through thick oak doors. The voices grew louder. Then one voice rose above the rest, sharp and venomous and unmistakable. "The king is compromised," Lord Harkin declared, his words carrying through the door like a thrown blade. "He has installed a packless stray in his private chambers, a woman of no name, no bloodline, no standing. The court demands an explanation." Sable's blood went cold. "The court demands nothing," Calem's voice replied, low and controlled and edged with something dangerous. "The court advises. I decide." "Then decide wisely," Harkin pressed. "Your Majesty, the packs are watching. A king who cannot produce an heir from an appropriate match. A king who keeps a gutter wolf in his bedchamber while refusing every noble bride presented to him. That king invites challenge." The hush that followed was so profound, Sable could hear her own heartbeat. "Are you challenging me, Lord Harkin?" Calem asked, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. The kind of quiet that preceded violence. "I am advising you," Harkin said, and Sable could hear the tremor beneath his bravado. "Remove the girl. Accept a suitable match, before someone less diplomatic than me forces the issue." The doors burst open. Sable scrambled to her feet as advisors poured out, their faces pale. Lord Harkin emerged last, walking quickly, his jaw clenched, his eyes finding Sable on the bench and narrowing with undisguised contempt. He leaned close as he passed. "Enjoy it while it lasts, stray," he murmured. "You do not belong here, and everyone knows it." He was gone before she could respond. Sable stood in the corridor, her hands shaking, Lord Harkin's words burrowing under her skin. Stray, gutter wolf, packless. She had heard those words her entire life, from the older children at the orphanage, from the wolves who turned her away when she applied for pack membership at 16, from the merchants on Cinder Row who let her buy bruised fruit at a discount because they felt sorry for her. She had built a life around those words, a small, careful life where she was useful enough to justify the space she occupied. And now she was in a palace, sleeping behind a screen in the king's bedchamber, receiving gloves she had never earned, and a powerful man had just confirmed what she had always suspected. She did not belong here. Sable walked back to the king's chambers, gathered her few belongings into the bag she had arrived with, and left a note on the nightstand. It read, "Thank you for the shelter funding. I am sorry I cannot stay." She made it as far as the side gate before Fenwick caught her. "Miss Wren," he said, slightly out of breath, which for Fenwick was the equivalent of a full sprint. "Where are you going?" "Home," Sable said. "Back to Cinder Row." "On whose authority?" "My own." She kept walking. I am not a prisoner here. Lady Iselda said I could leave whenever I chose. Fenwick fell into step beside her. She did say that. She also said that if you tried to leave, I should tell you something. I do not want to hear it. The king has not slept since you left the building. Sable stopped walking. It has been 40 minutes, Fenwick said, his voice quiet. He was in the study when Lord Harkin's words reached him through the staff. He went to the chambers. Found your note. He has been sitting in the dark since. Sable closed her eyes. The pull had become a roar. Every step she had taken toward the gate had made it worse, a tearing sensation like something vital being stretched past its limit. This is not fair, she whispered. No, Fenwick agreed. It is not. Sable stood at the gate, her bag in her hand, the evening air cold on her face. She could leave. She could walk back to Cinder Row, back to her cot at the shelter, back to the life she understood. She could let someone else figure out how to save the king, but she kept hearing his voice in the dark. Did I hurt you? She kept seeing the tremor in his hands, the way his fingers had released her wrist like she was something precious he had accidentally broken. She kept feeling the pull. Take me back, Sable said. The king's chambers were dark when she entered. The fire had burned low, casting everything in deep amber. Calum sat in the chair by the hearth, her note crumpled in his fist. He looked up when she walked in. His expression gutted her. You came back, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that made something inside her cave. Lord Harkin is a small, cruel man who bullies old women through his sons, Sable said, setting her bag down. I will not let him decide where I belong. Calum searched her face. Where do you belong? The question hung in the air between them. Sable looked at him, at the note crushed in his hand, at the fear he was not bothering to hide, and felt the last wall inside her crack. Here, she said. Apparently. He exhaled, long and shaking, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright. I will speak with Harkin, he said. You will do nothing of the sort, Sable replied, crossing the room. I punched his son in the throat. I can handle the father. The sound he made was almost a laugh. Almost. Close enough that Sable felt it settle somewhere warm and deep inside her. She moved to her side of the partition, set her bag down, and sat on the edge of her bed. Good night, Your Majesty, she said. Calum, he said quietly from the other side of the screen. Sable's heart stopped. My name is Calum, he said. Use it. She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep whatever sound was building in her throat from escaping. She breathed, steadied. Good night, Calum, she said. He was asleep within minutes. Sable lay in the dark, wide awake. The sound of his name still warm on her tongue. Sleep found her much, much later. It happened on the 32nd night. Sable woke to silence. Not the ordinary quiet of the king's chambers at rest, but something deeper, something wrong. The fire had burned to ash. The room was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She sat up and listened. No sound from the other side of the partition. Calum, she called softly. Nothing. Sable threw back her covers and moved around the screen. The king's bed was empty, the sheets tangled and thrown aside. But the door to the corridor was closed. The windows were latched. He was gone, but he had not left. Then she felt it. A pull so sharp it stole her breath, dragging her attention inward, toward something she could not see but could feel with absolute certainty. He was close, not in the room, not in the palace, but close in a way that defied the physical space between them. Her wolf surged forward with a desperate, clawing urgency she had never felt before. Sable looked at the bed, looked at the tangled sheets, looked at the pillow where his head had been, and she understood with a sickening lurch that he had not gotten up. His body was still there, but he was somewhere else. She reached out and touched his pillow. Her fingers brushed the linen and the world dissolved. The cold hit her first, then the silence, vast and suffocating. She stood in a landscape that should not exist, a gray plain stretching in every direction, featureless except for the sky, which was not a sky at all, but a low, churning ceiling of black cloud that moved like something alive. The ground beneath her feet was soft. Wrong. It gave slightly with each step, like walking on skin. "Calum!" she shouted, and her voice came back flat and dead, stripped of all resonance. She found him at the center of it. He was standing in a circle of scorched earth, surrounded by shapes. Not ghosts, not memories, but something worse. They were reflections of him. Dozens of them, standing in concentric rings, each one wearing his face but twisted into something monstrous. One had his features stretched into a permanent snarl. Another wore his face slack and empty. A third stood with hands raised and stained dark, the image of destruction made flesh. They were every version of himself he feared becoming, every failure he imagined, every atrocity he believed he was capable of, every worst case his exhausted, guilt-ravaged mind had constructed over 14 months of sleepless torture. And at the center of them all, the real Calum knelt with his head bowed, accepting their judgment. "Calum, look at me," she said, pushing through the ring of false kings. They turned their distorted faces toward her as she passed, but they were not real. They were his. She dropped to her knees in front of him. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring through her. "This is not real," she said. "None of this is real." "It is," he whispered, and his voice was hollow, emptied out. "This is what I am, what I will become. Every decision I make, every life I hold in my hands, this is where it leads." "No," Sable said firmly. "This is where fear leads. This is what happens when you carry everything alone for so long that your own mind turns against you." She reached for his face, cupping his jaw in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. His skin was ice cold. "You funded a shelter for broken wolves because a woman you barely knew mentioned it once," Sable said, her voice shaking. "You left bruise salve on my nightstand because your nightmare hurt my wrist. You sat in the dark with my note crushed in your hand because you were afraid I had left." She felt tears burning in her eyes. "Does that sound like a monster to you?" The false kings shifted. Their faces rippled. "You are not what you are afraid of," Sable continued. "You are what you do, and what you do, what you have always done, is carry more than any one person should ever have to carry, and refuse to put it down because you think no one else can hold it." She leaned closer, her forehead touching his. "But I can hold it," she whispered. "Let me hold some of it, please." The ground shuddered. The false kings began to fracture, cracks spreading across their twisted faces like glass breaking in slow motion. One by one, they came apart, dissolving into gray dust that was caught by a wind that had not existed a moment before. The churning sky above them thinned. Light, pale and uncertain, broke through in narrow shafts. Calum's hands came up and gripped her wrists. Not with the crushing force of his nightmare weeks ago, but with the desperate, trembling grip of a man reaching for the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. "I do not know how to stop," he said, his voice breaking. "I do not know how to be less than what they need me to be." "You do not have to be less," Sable said. "You just have to stop being alone." The last of the false kings shattered. The gray plain cracked beneath them, and light poured through the fractures, warm and gold and real. Sable blinked. She was back in the king's chambers, kneeling on the bed, her hands still on his face. Calum was looking up at her with eyes that were clear for the first time since she had known him. Not exhausted, not guarded, not performing strength for the benefit of everyone watching, just clear. "You were there," he said. "In that place. You came and found me." "Of course I did," Sable said, her voice thick. "You think I would just let you sit there?" He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand lingered, warm against her skin. "Sable," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something sacred. "I think you need to know something." "I already know," she whispered. "Say it," he breathed. "I need to hear you say it." "We are bonded," Sable said. "You and I. We have been since the beginning." His exhale was ragged with relief. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, his face pressing into her hair, and she felt his entire body shudder as 14 months of isolation cracked open. She held him the way she had held dying wolves at the shelter, with every ounce of steadiness she possessed. But this was not death. This was the opposite. This was someone coming back to life. "I do not deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "That is not your decision to make," Sable replied. He pulled back enough to look at her, and what she saw in his face stole her breath. Tenderness so profound, it rewrote every guarded expression she had ever seen him wear. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning for over a year and had finally broken the surface. His hands cradled her face, and Sable kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, foreheads touching, hearts hammering in tandem, Caleb said, "The partition is coming down." "Right now?" Sable asked, slightly dazed. "Right now." He stood, crossed the room, and pushed the oak screen aside with one hand like it weighed nothing. It scraped across the stone floor with a sound that felt final and permanent, and exactly right. Sable looked at the single undivided room, at him, standing in the firelight, his hand extended toward her. She took it. They stayed awake for a long time, talking in the dark, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, saying all the things they had been too afraid to say before. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the center of his bed, the bond settled into place between them like a key turning in a lock, warm and golden and unbreakable. Caleb slept through the night. No nightmares, no gray plane, no false kings. Just peace. The cord adjusted, eventually. A packless woman from Cinder Row as the Alpha King's bonded mate was not what anyone had envisioned. Lord Harkin protested formally. The noble families whispered behind their fans. The Borderland Pack sent letters demanding clarification. Iselda handled all of it with the calm, devastating efficiency of a woman who had been planning for this exact outcome for longer than anyone realized. "You knew," Sable said to her one afternoon, weeks after the bonding. "I suspected," Iselda corrected, sipping her tea. "The moment I saw you in that market square, facing down a wolf twice your size with nothing but your fists and your fury, I thought, that is the kind of woman who could save my son." "And if I had not been his mate?" Sable asked. Iselda's smile was small and knowing. "Then you would have been an excellent shelter director with significantly better funding." She paused. "But I am rarely wrong." Months passed. Caleb's health returned slowly. Then all at once, color flooding back into his face, strength returning to his hands, clarity sharpening his gaze until the man at the desk each morning was unrecognizable from the hollow wraith Sable had first seen slumped in that chair. He still had difficult nights. The gray plane did not vanish entirely. Some mornings, Sable woke to find his hand gripping hers so tightly her fingers had gone numb, his body rigid with the effort of fighting something she could not see. But she was always there. And slowly, the difficult nights grew further apart. The shelter on Cinder Row expanded. Sable insisted on overseeing it personally, queen or not, and Caleb learned quickly that arguing with his mate about the welfare of broken wolves was an exercise in futility equal to arguing with his mother about anything at all. "You married a version of her," Fenwick observed one evening, with the faintest trace of amusement. "I am aware," Caleb said flatly, "and I am choosing not to examine that too closely." On a quiet morning in early spring, Sable woke to pale light filtering through the curtains and the steady rhythm of Caleb beside her. His arm was wrapped around her waist. His face was peaceful. No tension, no tremor, no shadows. She watched him for a moment, warmth flooding through her so bright it almost hurt. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let sleep pull her under. Outside, the kingdom carried on. Inside, the king and his mate slept peacefully, together, and the world was quiet.